So at the end of the day, what we had here was the Democrats fell behind and they could never really recover in any substantial fashion. What became very evident were two things were happening. Independent voters who had by and large supported Obama were now moving over to the Republican camp in large numbers. McDonald carried independents on election day by more than 35%. That they just moved over en masse to the Republican side. And that was a wake-up call for Democrats nationally when that happened. And then secondly, Deeds had tremendous problem energizing Democrats in areas where the Democrats had previously run well. For example, I saw a number this morning that I was just kind of looking over things. Turnout in many Northern Virginia areas that the Democrats had previously won either went to McDonald or was lower than the state average. Fairfax County's turnout was 40%. McDonald carried Fairfax County, which is just striking. If Fairfax County had been sort of going blue, 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 McDonald carried Loudoun County with 61% of the vote. He carried Prince William County with 58% of the vote. And both of those counties had turnouts that were in the mid-30s. The Democrats just stayed home because with these. And it turned out to be an absolute catastrophe in the last 2 weeks because there was some hope that Barack Obama could come in and rally the troops. But what happens in elections is this curious thing. When you're way behind in the polls, even your own side begins to turn on you. Because they begin to think about who's going to get blamed for this, right? And we don't want to get blamed, right? It's not our fault. It's his fault. And so what happened is in the last 2 weeks, the Democrats engaged in a number of what I called pre-mortems on Deeds. That prior to the election actually taking place, they started placing blame on why he lost. So even while Obama was coming to Virginia, the same day his press secretary said, he's run a terrible campaign. The polls are showing that it's not our fault, it's his fault. And so what happened is that a lot of Democrats began to position each other for the aftermath. Who was going to get blamed? Was it going to be Obama? Was it going to be Kane? Was it going to be Deeds? And a lot of the national Democrats said, no, it's Deeds' fault. Send out that message. And his funding simply absolutely dried up. And probably as a result, the Democrats may have lost more seats in the House of Delegates, because in the last week of the campaign, it just went into free fall. The other thing that happened during the campaign that really harmed Deeds was essentially that while he didn't have a specific transportation plan, he did say one thing about it. He said he was going to raise everybody's taxes. And so he wound up in the worst of both worlds. No plan, but I'm going to raise your taxes. And the Democrats, not telling you what it was for. And the Republicans love that, because from their position, that kind of recreated this situation that occurred, some of you may be old enough to remember, 25 years ago at the national level with Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale. You might recall that at the presidential convention that year, Walter Mondale said, whoever's the next president is going to raise your taxes. Ronald Reagan won't tell you, I just did. And the Democrats stood up in the audience and cheered. And all the Republicans who were watching at home stood up and cheered. And Reagan went on to say, he said, there's a big difference between my opponent and myself. He says, I believe every day should be July 4th. He thinks it should be April 15th. But since that time, the Democrats typically have been very, very shrewd and smart when they talk about tax increases. They talk about combining them with middle-class tax cuts, right? Bill Clinton said that, right? Barack Obama in 2008, what was he going to do about tax cuts? Who was going to get them? 95% of the public was going to get a tax cut. Only who was going to pay higher taxes?
2%, the rich.
Yeah, either the rich. Or they do like Mark Warner did. They have a package of tax cuts, cut the food tax with tax increases. Or at a minimum, they provide a tax increase for a very specific good thing that people want, usually education on that front. But Deeds wound up in the worst of both worlds. No plan except the first thing he would do about it would be to raise their taxes. And the numbers just plummeted when that happened. So ultimately, very, very bad day for the Democrats at the statewide level, because it resulted in Jody Wagner also losing to the incumbent Bill Bolling by a large margin. It was always going to be difficult to beat an incumbent. And probably the most stunning area was that the Democrats had felt from the get-go that the Attorney General's job was theirs. That Steve Shannon would beat Ken Cuccinelli. Cuccinelli, a very well-known social conservative, had often taken stances against almost all his Republican colleagues as well. And the Democrats said, you know, he's going to be portrayed as a fringe guy, no problem. He won by 16 points on that front. He won in a landslide as well. And in fact, could turn out to be the most visible Attorney General in the history of Virginia. Because he's going to have his own agenda rather than just be a person looking to be the counsel for the state. But the fact is that it was a Republican triumph at the statewide level, and it then became reflected in the General Assembly election. I just want to mention couple of quick points here. You know, it is very, very difficult traditionally to beat a member of the General Assembly who's an incumbent. You know, local government officials actually tend to be far more vulnerable because you're involved with all these hot-button items that get citizens up in arms all the time, one way or the other, than General Assembly members. They have been remarkably insulated from popular passions. I mean, one year I mentioned, for example, that there was a greater turnover in the Powhatan Board of Supervisors than the entire General Assembly. Congratulations. But that's what happens in local elections. That local elections are ones where the public is very, very, when they're interested, they're passionate, and incumbents have a tougher time. There's no doubt about that. I don't think it was any tougher than normal this year, but typically the turnover in local officials is far higher than turnover in the General Assembly, where, and here's the example, the entire decade up until last Tuesday in the House of Delegates, 10 incumbents who ran were defeated. They had had 4 House of Delegate elections, 10 incumbents were defeated. Tuesday night, there were 9. The number of incumbents defeated in the General Assembly in 2009 almost matched the entire decade prior. 8 of them were Democratic incumbents, and only 1 was what I'd call a scandal-tainted Republican incumbent who lost. Other than that, it was all Democratic incumbents. The net result actually was simply only 6 seats, we think, because of the fact that the Democrats did pick up an open seat that Jeff Frederick departed in Prince William. But overall, it was an extraordinary night for the Republicans in the General Assembly, because without the benefit of a redistricting election,